Welcome back. So now I'd like to start thinking about perhaps a new way of exploring some of the complexities of these chromatic chords that we looked at in the last podcast. And the way I want to start thinking about complexity involves the concept of entropy. Now, entropy essentially is the level of disorganization, of randomness as well. It really comes from thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics states that entropy, or disorganization, randomness, always increases within a stable system. So if you think of a system like diatonicism in musical harmony, for example, if the second law of thermodynamics is to be obeyed, which doesn't have to in music, but if it was, then that complexity would increase, and that's exactly what happens. And I want to start looking at a particular moment of the increase in that complexity from the beginning of the 20th century. So there are lots of different ways in which music theorists have calculated entropy, or calculated that sense of increasing complexity in tonal music. But the way I want to do it today is based essentially around something which Leonard Meyer said way back in the 1950s, which was that entropy, he said, was associated with states of extreme tension in music. He said that when there is musical tension, those are the points when the music is more entropic. It is more disorganized. That's a rather strange way of thinking about it, but it's one which I want to run with. So how do we calculate entropy? Well, Claude Shannon in 1948 developed this particular formula using probability theory to calculate entropy. This essentially reads as the negative summation of any individual probability times the log of itself. So the possibility of rolling a 6 on this die is 0.167, and in fact it's the same for all of the different possibilities of this die. Now, because there are 6 possibilities, we then calculate like this. Pi then equals 0.167, and if we times that by the log 2 of itself, we arrive at 0.431. Now, of course, that is exactly the same for each of the other 5 possibilities. So we simply add these 6 possibilities together and we arrive at the grand total of 2.586. So 2.586 is the entropy for rolling a 6-sided dice. Now, if we roll an 8-sided dice, the probability of rolling a 6 is 0.125. which actually equates to higher entropy. It's actually 3 bits of entropy rather than the 6-sided dice, which had 2.586. Now, those numbers themselves are not exactly meaningful, but you can see how relatively they affect each other. Now, if the dice is loaded and we keep rolling 6s, entropy is radically reduced. There is perfect order. There is no randomness. It's going to roll a 6 every time. So what I would like to do with entropy is to essentially model the strength of those individual drives that we explored in the second podcast that happen within any given sonority. So we have a complicated sonority which has various different possibilities for its motion. It's got different dominant 7th style drives within it. And I want to see what the different strengths of those individual drives are, and then use that to build up a profile of how chaotic or how disorganized that individual section is. Okay, so the piece that I'm going to be using to model my concept of entropy as it flows throughout a piece of music is this one by Alexander Skryabin from 1907, and it's called Enigma, and it is a very enigmatic piece. There's various different interpretations of what this title Enigma means. My interpretation will become clear soon. One of the common reasons for thinking of it as an enigma is because this is the first piece in Skryabin's repertoire that doesn't end on what we would call a tonic chord. Instead, it ends with this tongue-in-cheek gesture. Now, to my mind, that is almost the key to the Enigma. And it's a key to the Enigma. It's the highest entropic moment. It's the moment of real entropy. We'll examine that in due course. Let's have a little listen to the piece, and then we'll start to look at the diagram that I've drawn of the piece and think about how this entropy is flowing through it. So the grid that I'm producing looks like this. There are 2 pages to it, and you're perfectly free to download that from chromatichaharmony.com, or you're welcome to pause the screen now and have a look. You may want to revise podcast 2 if you're not quite sure how to read some of these shapes. There is a key or a legend to explain what these individual shapes mean. Remember that they refer to all of the different individual drives which occur at any given moment in the piece of music. Let's, for example, look at the first moment in the piece. The right hand clearly has an A-flat triad, and it's got a G-flat beneath it, so we definitely have a drive on A-flat there, an A-flat 7. We also have a rising G-flat 7 drive and a B-flat drive in the same time. Now, it's very unlikely that we'll experience all 3 together and think of them as individual separate things. One of those might well be stronger than the others. What I'm using is entropy to try and work out which are the strongest ones and which are the weakest ones. Now, all of these numbers in the individual drives all should add up to 100. That's because they're all percentages or probabilities. I'm using probability and mapping it as strength. Why probability? Well, the probability I'm associating with strength is that if there is a discharge of tension at this moment, what's the probability that this particular drive will be discharging it? And that's essentially the same thing as asking how strong is this individual drive, just in probability terms. This can then be used to calculate entropy, which I've written down at the bottom of each column. So, in moments like this one at bar 26, you'll see that the G7 drive there has 100% probability, not of discharging, but remember, that's the strength. So the question is, if there is to be a discharge of tension there, what is the probability of G being the drive that discharges it? Well, it's 100% because that's the only drive. At that particular moment, there will be extremely low entropy, as you can see, 0. But in that opening moment of the piece, where there are 3 drives happening at the same time, we'll see that entropy is 1.55. The first thing that we need to do is to work out what the probability is of each of these different drives being the one that will discharge, which is essentially working out their strength. Now, in order to do this, we have to ask 8 individual questions. So to calculate the strength of each individual drive, I ask 8 questions, giving essentially a strength score to each answer. Each question has a different weight of the overall strength of the dominant drive. The weight's represented in percentages. Important questions will have a bigger weighting than perhaps less significant questions. The answer will always come out at 100. So the questions are essentially these. The first one, which is an important one, is how robust is each 5/7 configuration? I'm applying a formula from Fred Lerdahl for this, based on his 2001 book Tonal Pitch Space, where he calculates tonal tension in all sorts of different types of chords. By robustness, I mean things like, is it a full dominant 7th chord, or is there a pitch missing? Is one of the pitches raised or lowered? Is it altered in some way? Each of those can affect the strength. Now, the strength is quite important, so I've given that a weight of 40%. The second question I'm asking of each individual drive is it rooted in the bass? Now, in the first bar of this Skryabin piece, the drive on G-flat is rooted in the bass, so perhaps that might give it some extra strength. Tonal centricity is another question that needs to be asked. If a tonal center is established, how far away is this from the circle of fifths? Now, if the drive is miles away from a tonal center, we would probably give it a very low score. And that is also predicated on a tonal center being established, which in this Skryabin piece, it probably isn't, at least not very strongly. The fourth question I'm asking is, how many times has the drive already occurred? In other words, what's its redundancy? How many times has it already occurred? And by this, I give a full percentage of all of the drive occurrences. How many times, for example, has G7 occurred? What's the percentage of those occurrences out of all of the drives that have happened so far? Next question, the fifth question, is the redundancy of the resolution, the redundancy of the tension discharge. How often has this drive discharged before? If this drive has discharged lots of times, then you're probably more likely to hear it because it will be stronger. By this, I'm giving a full percentage of all of the discharges that have happened before. We also need to think about textural differentiation. Is the drive articulated clearly in the texture? Well, this is one of the reasons why the first chord, A flat, is quite a strong drive, because it's given in the right hand of the piano and it's heard well above the left hand. There's a very, very clear registral difference occurring. The next question, the seventh question, is was the 5/7 chord itself, the drive itself, or its dominant contained in the previous chord. That's a sense of continuity from what's just happened before. If we're talking about a drive on C, if that was preceded by a G7 drive, then that might well be considered to be quite a bit stronger. Equally, if the drive itself, C7, was part of the previous complex of drives, then that might also be stronger. The last question I'm asking, which I think is slightly less significant than some of the others, in fact the last two I've given 5% in my overall weighting. The last question is root redundancy. Is the root duplicated at the octave? If you've got a complicated sonority, you might find that there is one pitch which happens more than the others, and the root might be the pitch that's duplicated, in which case I would give that an additional score out of 100. So let's work through an example. The example we'll give is this one from bar 27 of the piece. Okay, so if we take this chord here, that's one of the slightly more straightforward ones. This has, in essence, a G7 drive in that with an augmented fifth, and it has a B7 drive in that as well, and it also has an F drive in. So let's have a look at how these calculate. The G has got a slightly less robust profile than the B and the F. The G has a score of 92, the B has full 100%, as does the F. The next question then is, where is the bass? Now the bass is in G, so that's fairly straightforward. The G gets the full 100 score. The next question, tonal centricity. That's a moot point because tonal centers haven't really been established in this piece, certainly not by this stage, so we don't give a score for that. The fourth question, the redundancy of occurrence of this particular drive. How many times has the drive occurred? Well, the drive has all of those three drives have only occurred a very small number of times, so those are extremely small numbers. The fifth question, how many times has the drive discharged? Of the 5 moments of tonal discharge in the piece, there has only been one of these drives that has had one of those moments, and that's F. So that itself is quite a low score. The sixth question, textural differentiation. Here we can see that the G has got a much more prominent texture, certainly helped by its bass and being in the lower register, and the B and the F have slightly lower prominence in the texture. The seventh question, previous drive redundancy. The G7 was present in the drive before, that's a sense of continuity, hence that has a score of 50. The eighth question, root redundancy. So we have 100% given to B, which occurs multiple times in that complex sonority. So here then we have a total score, averaged out, factoring in the weightings for each of those individual drives. Now these are all individually out of 100, so we need to disperse these across as percentages. So there's 37% likelihood of the G, there's 33% likelihood of the B, and 30% of the F. And those are plotted on the grid. We add in the log scores, and that produces an entropy of 1.58 for that complex. Now that's only interesting when you start comparing it with the entropy for the entire piece, which is what we do in this next graph. This is the profile of the entropy in the entire piece, and you'll see that it starts off with a relatively strict entropic profile hovering around the 150 mark. But then in the B section of the piece, we start to see these quite wild distributions of entropy, it becoming quite entropic at moments like this, and then absolutely organized diatonically at those moments, for example, at bar 26 and bar 36 and 32. Those will be the moments when there is only ever one drive, which will obviously therefore be the strongest at that given time. The two crucial points to watch, and which we'll now zoom in on, are these two here. The second of these is actually slightly higher than the first. So you can see that through this entropic profile of the piece, part of the luster of the piece is not just that it ends on a chord which is non-tonic, but it actually ends on its highest, most chaotic moment, its highest entropic moment, we might say. Okay, so on this drive analysis grid, there's quite a lot of information here. We can zoom in on these individual entropy scores along the bottom here, and I want to look at those two particular high points, the high moments of entropy. We've got this one here, 2.56. Now you can see here that this is essentially a whole tone configuration of drives. Each drive is separated by a whole tone. We have one on B, one on A, one on G, one on F, one on E flat, and one on D flat. So this is the first whole tone chord that we get in the piece, the first purely whole tone chord. Now, Abstractly, yeah, that does sound like a whole tone chord, but bear in mind the kind of world we've been existing in, which has been not quite whole tone. This to me sounds just like one of the many sumptuous type of chords that we get. It's almost as if it's just accidentally whole tone. But you can also see how one of these is slightly stronger than the others. That's that one with 23. That D flat has the bass, and it is strongest in terms of the fact that it's just happened before. There are various different factors that produce that sense that that is the strongest of those drives. Very, very different to the actual whole tone chord, the pure one, the really distilled moment that we get right at the very end, which is just a run up the whole tone scale. It's in its most abstract state. We can see how it's got a slightly higher entropy there, 2.58. Why is that higher? Well, that's because the probabilities are slightly nearer even in this particular configuration. You can hear how there is very, very little context to this. It seems like a very, very abstract gesture. There isn't really a bass to speak of. There is no real textural differentiation. A lot of those questions are asked, we have very, very low scores for. So this high point of the piece, this sudden moment at the end, which in many ways is the Enigma, is our highest entropic moment, which is quite a significant thing. It's also an interesting moment because when we compare this with the overall profile of the piece, we can also see another interesting thing. You'll see here on the grid that I've given some squares white backgrounds and some of the rows have grey backgrounds. Those represent essentially the different whole tone scales. And you can see how for most of the first part of the piece, up until here, where the piece begins its slightly more languid sort of atmosphere, we essentially use mostly the white whole tone squares. Now remember that this music is not whole tone music. There are some mystic chords, some diatonic collections, but essentially all of the drives are dispersed in whole tone space. That only starts to change when we have this octatonic collection here. You'll see how from this section here, about 15 to 22, we are essentially using octatonic spaces, but two different octatonic spaces. Here we have drives on C, A, E flat, and F sharp or G flat, and those are the only moments of real discharge in the piece, which then discharge into a new octatonic collection, a cycle of fifths away from it, to D, F, A flat and B flat in this particular section, right at the midpoint of the piece. Why is entropy lower for octatonic collections than it is for whole tone collections? Well, that's because the octatonic scale has essentially 4 different drive possibilities at the same time, whereas a whole tone scale has 6 drive possibilities. We only reach the entire whole tone scale here at bar 31. Another interesting aspect of this graph, which speaks about the kind of hovering light atmosphere of the piece, in contrast to the Szymanowski piece that we used this type of analysis for in the second podcast, is that in this particular piece there are no discharges of tension except these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here at that crucial point in the middle. And in fact this one from F to B is minuscule there and only very, very small. That's partly what gives this piece its light, ethereal atmosphere. And it is also an interesting aspect because it helps us to see how this final moment, this most entropic moment in the piece, is in a sense the riddle to the piece. It's the enigma of the piece because it's a pure abstract whole tone scale. And it's the abstract whole tone scale which seems to be directing the space in which these drives are given. Not necessarily the type of tonal pitch material that is being used, but the space in which the drives are being dispersed. So what is the enigma of this piece? Well, to me, the key to the enigma is in that final high entropic gesture right at the very end, that whole tone gesture, which is a pure abstract whole tone scale, very different to the pitch material that's being used in the piece. And yet the pure crystalline abstraction of that whole tone scale at the end informs us in a way, which we perhaps didn't already know, that all of the different drives, all of these tensions, these pulsations that have been occurring throughout the music have occurred in pure abstract crystalline whole tone space. However, this creates something of a paradox. If we viewed this piece from the perspective of whole tone organization, our entropy profile would be completely reversed. The final moment, that beautiful whole tone chord, would in fact be the lowest moment of entropy. Entropy would be completely gone. It would be absolutely organized there at the last moment. So that reminds us, of course, that what I'm looking at in my method of analysis here is one specific way of calculating entropy based from a diatonic perspective, and specifically the diatonicism of the 5/7 to 1 motion. I hope that what I've done though today is give you a plausible alternative to current methods of thinking about entropy and disorganization that started to happen to the tonal system at the beginning of the 20th century, and in fact well before that. So I've tested this type of analysis with composers like Debussy, Charles Ives, Joseph Suk, composers particularly from the turn of the 20th century whose harmonies are quite thick with all of these rich, ambiguous meanings. It could even potentially work well with composers like Schoenberg, although we're not supposed to be listening out for individual diatonic motions of, say, a leading note to a tonic in most of Schoenberg's writings. It doesn't mean to say that they aren't potentially there. It doesn't mean that we can't necessarily hear them. So this is perhaps a good way of analysing that particular type of music. One of the things I quite like about this analysis is that it tries to bring out what is to some extent there in these rich harmonies which we perhaps wouldn't otherwise necessarily think of as being there. It allows us perhaps to look at these drives as if they were data, and then after we've collected them start to reflect on how we potentially might hear the music differently, or perhaps even hear it in a more enriched way. So I hope you've enjoyed this short series of podcasts and that you found them interesting and stimulating in your own work and your own research. If you're interested, then please do get in touch with me. You can have a look at my website, chromaticheharmony.com, and there you can explore various resources, some of which relate to these podcasts and some of which relate to my new book, Desire in Chromatic Harmony. I look forward to hearing from you if you're interested. Thank you.